Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Shuhos, and I am the Assistant Events Coordinator at Brookline Booksmith. I just want to start off by thanking all of you so much for logging in and joining us tonight and for supporting these amazing people as well as Brookline Booksmith. We know there's a lot going on right now, so from the bottom of our hearts, really thank you for joining us. Now, before we get started, just a couple of Crowdcast Pro tips. You can chat in the sidebar all throughout the event, so feel free. If you have any questions, you can click on the button below that very helpfully says Ask a Question, and it will then appear in the queue. You can also just type a question into the chat and follow the pop-up message, and then that will also appear in the queue. You can upvote other questions if you want, if you see a really cool question that you want to see answered. So definitely make use of that if you like. But for the reason that we are all here tonight, we at the Booksmith are so proud to have with us Joseph Nevins, Suren Moodliar, and Eleni Macrakis, co-authors of A People's Guide to Greater Boston. Affirming the hopes, interests, and struggles of individuals and groups on the receiving end of unjust forms of power, this book showcases the ground-level forces shaping the city of Boston and its outlying neighborhoods and municipalities. The guide takes readers to sites of oppression, resistance, organizing, and transformation in Boston and beyond. It highlights movements to abolish slavery, to end war and militarism, to achieve native sovereignty, racial equity, gender justice, and sexual liberation, and to secure workers' rights. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this wonderful book and support these authors as well as Brookline Booksmith, simply click on the green button below that says Buy the Book. And without further delay, ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Nevins, Suren Moodliar, and Eleni Macrakis.
Thank you. I want to try out our video before starting, so let's see if that works, our slide presentation. Yep, it says too many video sources, so one of us has to go off.
Okay, I'm gonna close myself out of the video, and you guys can just go, okay? And I'll be back in a bit.
Thank you, Adam.
All right.
Oops. You know, we still have that problem.
Yeah, I can't close myself out of this completely, guys. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's not allowing me.
I can go off screen until
Okay.
my section, if that works.
Okay, so we apologize for this rather clunky beginning. We're still getting used to the technology, and so Eleni, are you going to go off?
Eleni, why don't you wait until after the introduction to go off?
Okay.
Okay.
In which case, someone else has to go off.
Oh, all right. So let me do that.
You know, I still get the information that there are too many sources. Should we proceed without the slide presentation? I guess that's a vote, right, Eleni and Joe?
At least for the intro, and then one of us can go off, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So, good evening, everyone. I should say that for some months in the COVID-19 prehistory, I'd really been looking forward to this event as a former Brookline resident. And it was not so much because we have a book to share with readers, but for that after-event scoop of ice cream at JT Lick's down the road. So much for those plans. Of course, history interrupts the best-laid plans, frustrating our ambitions and forcing us to pay attention to problems that the powerful ignore, set aside, or repress. As such, A People's Guide to Greater Boston is about how the past and present speak to one another so that we may create a future that corresponds to the interests of the people. Where should we begin this book? One starting point for our conversation could be noting the unusually warm weather in Siberia, once home to the permafrost. Yet another starting point for our book about Boston is the present moment of global rebellion. Why these starting points? Because Our People's Guide is about how our city has shaped the world and is being shaped by it. If we are to think about the catastrophic climate change signaled by Siberia's methane emissions, we have to think about our city's contribution to global warming. And if we are to think about the present rebellion, broad and intersectional as it is, we have to think about this city's founding as a republic of race and capital. Indeed, before our city came to be, one of its founders, John Winthrop, made practical plans while still anchored in a harbor in England. He imagined integrating the future colony into an emerging world economy, one that would also invent a global racial and class structure. But our city is also home to David Walker, somebody who challenged the world that John Winthrop made from his home in Boston. He, as in David Walker, accepted the prospect of violence to challenge a violent system. He turned to the then recent history of the Haitian Revolution as part of a long revolution against slavery for inspiration. As a result, in Boston, we can claim some of the roots of a future Pan-Africanism and a future human rights doctrine. If we are appalled at our city's role in war making, say Raytheon and the maiming of children in Yemen, Boston can also claim to be the birthplace of peace movements, from Anne Hutchinson's activism against the Pequot War in the 1630s through to mass peace action today, challenging the aforementioned corporation. From these few observations, you get a sense of just how wide-ranging our book is. It will therefore be helpful for Eleni to say a few words about how this ambition is structured across 312 pages. Eleni?
Our book is organized spatially, as guidebooks tend to do. We hope that this allows an experience of the city through walking, biking, or taking public transportation. The book starts with 14 groupings of Boston neighborhoods, such as the Boston Harbor, Back Bay and the Fenway, Dorchester, Mattapan and Hyde Park, and Roxbury and Mission Hill, and then takes us to adjacent towns and cities, such as Cambridge, Somerville, and Chelsea, further west to places such as Concord and Waltham, north to cities such as Lynn, Newburyport, and Lawrence, and lastly, south to the South Shore. We also have included 6 thematic tours, including a Malcolm and Martin tour that includes sites in and around Boston associated with Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King during their time in Boston. And then we also have a tour on the Bread and Roses strike from 1912 in Lawrence, as well as a 1% tour in about the 1% in Greater Boston.
First of all, my name is Joe Nevins. Pleasure to be here. As the title of the book suggests, it's literally a guidebook. It's one organized, as Eleni made clear, around particular sites. At the same time, it's a lot more than a guidebook in that we seek to tell a story, one about Greater Boston's historical geography. So in addition to focusing on particular sites, City of Boston neighborhoods, and various municipalities north, south, and west of the city, the book tells a story about the making of Greater Boston as a region. And what we mean by this, by region, is an area that shares a lot, that is characterized by strong ties within and lots of divisions. Right? We explore these ties and divisions, how they were made, challenged, and struggled over, as a way of trying to make sense of what Greater Boston was and is, while laying the foundation for it to become something or someplace better. This speaks to our approach, one that is explicitly, you might say, from below or from the political, economic, social, and ideological margins, a perspective of so-called people. A people's perspective privileges the desires, hopes, and struggles of those on the lower ends of unjust hierarchies and those allied with them, and those who work to challenge such inequities and to realize a Greater Boston in a larger world that is radically inclusive and democratic, and that centers equality and social and environmental justice. To tell the story that we do over 400 years, we had to make choices, hard choices, about what to include and what not to include. What we'll do tonight is focus on 3 historical moments and important sites that those times that, were in those time frames to give you a sense of what we do in the book. Those moments or time spans are the 1840s, 1919, and the 1970s. Apologize that we don't have the images to share with you. I guess we'll post them on our website so you can look at them later if we can't get the technology working in the interim. But we'll start with the 1840s with Suren.
Okay. The period of the 1840s are particularly apposite to the present moment. It was the time right before the second industrial, or right after the first industrial revolution, and right before the Civil War beginning in 1861. And for us, in looking at the book and exploring different sites across the city of Boston, we were interested to discover how it is that Boston contributed to what became the polarization between North and South that led to ultimately a war of liberation, one of emancipation, one that freed the slaves, freed the enslaved people. And so we identified a number of sites, and what we were not so much surprised to find, but what we were so happy to discover was that there's a plethora, an embarrassment of choice as far as sites that help tell the story of the moments at which the nation became more polarized on the question of slavery, leading ultimately to the Civil War. One such moment occurred in 1842, and we write about the site. It's the old Boston Courthouse in Courthouse Square, right on State Street, present-day State Street in Boston. There we tell the story of George Latimer, an escaped enslaved person. He arrived in Boston in 1842, having fled his owner in Virginia. He arrived by sea and was promptly detained at the request of his owner, who had heard from a slave catcher operating in Boston that George Latimer had arrived in town. Immediately, Latimer was detained and held in Leverett Circle Jail. And if there had not been any kind of community response, Latimer would have been expelled to the South in terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, federal law that required northern states to essentially deport people back to the South. Latimer, however, aroused a lot of sympathy, and instead of an immediate deportation to the South, instead what happened was that a court case was held to determine whether his owner had the right to request his return to the South. And this brought about an incredible movement. Several hundred people gathered at the steps of the courthouse to challenge, one, whether there would in fact be a trial rather than the immediate manumission of George Latimer. In addition to that, a broader community, aside from those people taking direct action, organized newspapers and other forms of solidarity to ensure that the Latimer case would be something not merely litigated in the courts, but challenged on the streets and in broader public opinion. Now, this is in the 1840s. It was well after the founding of the immediate abolition movement in the late 1820s, but also a little bit before the war itself, before the Civil War, right? About 20 years or so before the Civil War. And what was interesting about this period is that there were other cases, both before and after this, that in which this issue gets litigated in public opinion. In this particular case, Latimer is ultimately ordered back to the South. However, as a result of the solidarity of the broader abolition movement, Latimer is instead freed because some abolitionists helped buy his freedom. So not quite the kind of freedom story one would like to tell, but it does reveal many different dimensions of the abolition movement. In particular, we learn about the diverse strands of it. There were wealthy abolitionists who could afford to pay for the freedom of somebody. In addition to that, there were the people who gathered on the steps of the courthouse, largely African American, right? Or as they saw themselves then as Africans, right? Living in Boston. And they were able to gather there because the main African-American neighborhood at that time was a few blocks away in what is present-day Beacon Hill. As such, they could take direct action for this to happen. Now, if you think that this act of manumission, this act of solidarity was isolated, there were many other cases in this period as well. I'll just mention some of them and give you a sense of what we would today call intersectional character of our movements. Outside of Boston, there was a strong abolitionist movement as well, and it consisted not of our typical, of our stereotype of the abolitionists. It consisted of a wide range of people, and I'll mention one of them right now. There was a newspaper operating in Lowell, so the home of the industrial, or one of the homes of the Industrial Revolution in Massachusetts and in the country, right? Operating there was a newspaper, a monthly, published by workers themselves, called The Voice of Industry. And The Voice of Industry sought for itself the following mission: the abolition of mental, moral, and physical servitude in all their complicated forms. So the people who subscribed to and wrote for this newspaper consisted of workers, but also the face of the working class then, the most prominent face, were mill girls, women from the rural areas, from New Hampshire, from around Lowell, from the farms, who were working in factories. That was the working class at that moment. And their aims were profound, the abolition of mental, moral, and physical servitude. And so part of that mission meant solidarity with the enslaved people. Ironically, the mill workers were employed in mills processing cotton that came up from the South. So there was a strange kind of solidarity then between these two different parts of the working class. So if you read history books of that period, people talk of the lords of the lash and the loom, signifying the commonality of interest between the cotton plantation owners and the industry and industrial leaders themselves. With The Voice of Industry, however, we discover another kind of solidarity, the solidarity of the working classes between the enslaved part of the working class and the so-called free labor part of the working class that nonetheless had many issues of their own to organize upon. There are other sites that we cover in the book, also in Lowell, but in other places too. For example, the mill workers received the Amistad Sailors when they were traveling around the United States. Not to take up too much time, I'll just say one or two things about that moment. The Amistad Sailors had seized control of their ship. These were people destined for slavery who seized control of their ship, and that ship landed in the United States. There was an attempt by the owners of the ship to recover the ship and its so-called cargo, the human beings it had enslaved. These enslaved individuals litigated their case in the courts, but in order to litigate it, a wide network of solidarity was built in order to challenge their enslavement in the court of public opinion. And as such, they went from place to place speaking to people. Among the people they met were the mill girls of Lowell. And these folks not only welcomed them at St. Paul's Church, but in addition, they donated the equivalent of 25 workers' weekly wages to the cause of the Amistad Sailors. We could go around to several other sites, including in Lynn, Massachusetts, which was home to a vibrant anti-slavery society, the Lynn Female Anti-Slavery Society. Among other things, they conducted a petition in the late 1830s, and it continued into the 1840s, demanding an end not only to slavery, but a broader freedom along racial lines. So they opposed Massachusetts anti-miscegenation laws. So for them, the cause of Black freedom was much more than about emancipation of the enslaved people. It was for a broader racial equality. In Lynn as well, in the 1840s, we find workers organizing, workers, in this case, predominantly white workers, who had developed a very early sense of class consciousness in the shoe industry. They published a newspaper, and in the book we described both the newspaper and its location in Lynn. And this newspaper was called The Awl, after an instrument used by workers in that industry. But one of the quotes that we pull out from the newspaper in our book is the following statement. And I'm reading: "The division of society into the producing and the non-producing classes, and the fact of the unequal distribution of value between the two, introduces us at once to another distinction, that of capital and labor. Labor now becomes a commodity. Antagonism and opposition of interest is introduced in the community. Capital and labor stand opposed." So for all those people who talk about an exceptional United States, certainly in the 1840s, a broad intersectional working class movement emerged. It emerged before even Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and it signified sort of the native consciousness of that working class. And we could cite many more examples from the book, and in fact, the book does explore these. But I'd like to leave the 1840s at this moment and then turn to the period of the 19 teens and 20s. Eleni?
I'm going to take us back up north to Lawrence, Massachusetts, otherwise known as Strike City. Lawrence was founded and planned as an industrial city, just like Lowell, as Suren mentioned, in 1845. And in fact, one of our thematic tours is around the Bread and Roses strike of 1912, likely the strike that many of you have heard about. What some may not realize is that the labor movement continued there for several decades. The 1919 strike grew out of a campaign by unions in Lawrence, part of a national and worldwide effort to cut the work week from 54 to 48 hours. In fact, there are bumper stickers in Lawrence today that remind us to thank union workers for our weekend. Mill owners nationally accepted the demand of reducing the work week, but said they would not raise hourly wages. Conservative leadership of the National United Textile Workers led the majority of workers nationally to accept this offer. In Lawrence, unionists demanded 54 hours of pay for 48 hours of work. This demand, among other grievances around poor housing, harsh discipline, and discrimination in the workplace, led to the February 3rd, 1919 strike of some 20,000 workers. This strike was characterized by aggressive police violence. On February 26, 1919, police on horseback attacked a picket line of thousands of strikers and their supporters in front of the Arlington Mills. Among the crowd was A.J. Musty, a Christian minister, the head of the strike committee, and a famous pacifist. He later played important roles in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. Police clubbed Musty after catching up to him in a nearby alley and arrested him for disturbing the peace and loitering. Thanks to the workers, enough money was raised to pay his bail, and he was back on the picket line the next day. Later in the strike, police escalated their opposition by mounting machine guns at major intersections. The labor movement in Lawrence was strong because of its base, a diverse group of immigrants who came together around a common set of goals, like Suren mentioned earlier. Musty's role was not one of an organizer. The strike had many skilled leaders. It was this leadership, in fact, that likely led the organizers to reach out to prominent out-of-towners like Musty who could build their support base. This strike lasted more than 3 months, ending on May 20th, when mill owners accepted most of the workers' demands. While the Arlington Mills was at one point one of New England's largest textile production complexes, a decline in textile manufacturing led to its close in 1952. Today, the complex is home to loft apartments. The same year, about 4,000 Boston telephone operators went on strike for higher wages and better working conditions. Their workplace was the New England Telephone Company Exchange, which was located in Chinatown at 8 Harrison Avenue. The strikers were almost all young Irish American women. During the 6-day work stoppage, there was no telephone service in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Historian Stephen Norwood calls this strike probably the most complete response ever to a strike call involving workers across state lines. Almost every telephone worker in 5 of the 6 New England states walked off the job, about 8,000 workers in total. The strikers were part of the first women-led and controlled U.S. trade union, the Telephone Operators Department, a self-governing entity within the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW. More than a third of the union's members were in New England, mainly Boston, an outgrowth of their presence in the city of the National Women's Trade Union League. Strikers experienced strong support across the city, from Boston's largely Irish working class, and even to the Boston police, who later went on strike the same year, and the city's political leadership. In Chinatown, the site of one of Boston's principal telephone exchanges, neighborhood merchants set up tables behind the building to serve food to the striking workers in solidarity. Meanwhile, Chinese residents helped to picket the building. Such factors help explain why the telephone operators won the strike and gained substantial pay increases despite opposition to the labor stoppage from the IBEW's male leadership and the use of strike breakers, many of whom were students from Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. Not far from 8 Harrison Avenue, the Common Cupboard, a restaurant owned by the mother of Rose Sullivan, vice president of the telephone operators department, was a meeting place advertised in a Boston newspaper as a place for radicals, a place where talk is carried on briskly on all sorts of subjects. Theorists of all sorts are free to air their pet ideas. In the words of one FBI agent, the restaurant was a rendezvous for socialists and malcontents of every class, from the dynamite anarchists to the pink tea socialists. Many of the telephone operators union members were regulars. Urban renewal in the 1960s erased Common Street entirely. Unfortunately, there's a photo in our slideshow that shows this photo from the Boston Redevelopment Authority where it's there are notes from the surveyor from when they were doing the urban renewal effort. We'll post the photos later. Another strike later in the fall of 1919 rocked the city of Boston. On September 9th, 1919, 1,134 Boston police officers of 1,500 voted for an immediate strike. The vote was a response to the firing of 19 officers by Boston's police commissioner for organizing a union. Large crowds gathered, some in support of the strikers, others assembled to voice their anger towards officers whom they saw as abusive. The first couple nights of the strike saw riots in South Boston, when National Guardsmen started being pelted with stones and mud. When National Guardsmen started being pelted with stones and mud, the 10th Regiment's Company G of Police Station 6 was called in. The Guardsmen marched with riot guns and bayonets drawn and formed a line across West Broadway near E Street. Rioters taunted the soldiers, and the Guardsmen opened fire, killing 2 young men. The next day, negotiations were underway between the labor leaders and the mayor at the time. However, Governor Calvin Coolidge undercut the mayor by seizing control of the police department and firing all the strikers. This reflected the sharp divide at the time between the city and state's Protestant elite and Boston's largely Irish Catholic working class. Boston police, working class at the time, were working between 73 and 98 hours per week, and not with overtime like today. Required to buy their own uniforms and did not receive a raise between 1898 and 1913, even when the cost of living in Boston doubled. Today, Boston police officers receive middle-class salaries, many higher, and like police unions across the country, as we're seeing today and up until today, the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association generally opposes efforts at police reform and accountability and displays little solidarity with the interests of working-class people. Division 6 station remained in operation until 1981. In 2015, the South Boston Neighborhood Development Corporation, a local CDC, renovated the D Street building as part of their anti-gentrification efforts in the neighborhood and opened Patriots Home, a 25-unit development for military veterans and their families. Across town, in the Fenway, a different political action also occurred the same year. In a place known for its baseball, traffic, home to the last team in Major League Baseball to racially integrate, Fenway Park. This will probably come as a surprise to most of you, but perhaps the largest crowd in Fenway Park's history was not one watching a miraculous comeback or devastating defeat, but a crowd assembled to protest racism, the type inextricably tied to colonialism. On June 30th, 1919, at least 50,000 people, with many more outside the stadium's gates, gathered at Fenway to demand an end to British rule of Ireland. To give a bit of context, this crowd was 3 times larger than the number who had seen the Red Sox and Babe Ruth win the World Series the previous year. Eamon de Valera, president of the Irish Republic, had come to the U.S. to raise money for nationalist forces and to win diplomatic recognition from the U.S. government. After this historic crowd and event at Fenway, he traveled to the city of Lawrence, back up north, which became the first U.S. city to officially recognize the Republic of Ireland. 1919 in Greater Boston was a year of strikes and working class solidarity that continued through many years. Joe will now speak to this in the 1970s.
Thanks, Eleni. If you ask people from around the country what was going on in Boston in the 1970s, the conflicts around what was popularly known as busing, or better said, perhaps, the efforts to desegregate the public schools, is what most people would probably mention. And we certainly deal with that in the book, and we have a number of sites that we explore in relation to that. But there was a lot more going on. And as we've seen, these goings on often saw people working across differences such as race, gender, and neighborhood. One of the places that we explore is associated with the Black Panther Party, which was established in Boston, its Boston chapter at least, in May or June 1968. Many of its founders were Boston-born students from Northeastern University. While the Panthers focused originally on fighting police brutality, its activities were actually much broader, growing out of a politics that was revolutionary, socialist, and third worldist in nature. The Boston chapter, for example, worked in alliance with Students for Democratic Society to put an end to the U.S. war in Vietnam, and worked on local efforts to boycott grapes, right, in solidarity with the United Farm Workers. The Panthers in Boston implemented a number of programs, including a free breakfast for children, a free clothing program, and transportation to friends and family members of incarcerated women and men to Massachusetts prisons. Right, but its probably most important activity was the Franklin Lynch People's Free Health Center, which is located at Tremont Street at Ruggles Street in Roxbury. It opened in May 1970, and it reflected the Panthers' insistence on what they called completely free government-provided health care in terms of both prevention and treatment, and especially for what they said were all Black and oppressed people. A trailer served as the clinic's home. It was sited on vacant land that the Panthers and the Black United Front in Boston had occupied to block the planned construction of a highway where the Southwest Corridor, the Orange Line, now runs. Medical professionals, Black and white, volunteered their labor at the clinic, as did many lay medical professionals. The clinic, which offered 24-hour service, provided checkups, immunization, gynecological service, and pregnancy and blood tests. Right? It also ran a free sickle cell anemia program that sent volunteers to cities, to neighborhoods throughout Boston. Today, somewhat ironically, the headquarters of the Boston Police Department sit on the site of the clinic. Let me mention a couple of related sites. Right? The Black Panther Clinic speaks to how Boston was, in a lot of ways, a pioneer in the realm of public health care. And one manifestation of this was the Columbia Point Health Center. It opened in December 1965. It was the first community health center in the United States. Before its establishment, residents of the Columbia Point Housing Project had to take at least 3 buses to reach Boston City Hospital and healthcare. The center at Columbia Point gained national attention as a successful model of affordable health services to historically underserved populations, especially those without health insurance. With help from the federal government, the model quickly spread. And by 1971, there were 18 such centers, community health centers in Boston as a whole. Not long ago, the Columbia Point Health Center merged with the Neponset Health Center. It now operates as the Geiger-Gibson Health Center. A second related site was in the basement of a building in the Blomley Heath housing project, which is today known as the Mildred Haley Apartments. They're located on the Roxbury-Jamaica Plain border. There, the Panthers ran a free clothing program. Across the street from the projects on Walden Street was a place called the Helen Keller Collective. Right? It also served as the headquarters for an organization that was called, and is still called, Science for the People. Science for the People was an organization that emerged around 1970 in the Boston area. It was made up of activist-oriented graduate students from Harvard and MIT, and Boston area scientists and others who were concerned with the use of science and engineering for the narrow ends of war, militarism, and capitalist profit. In pursuit of its politics, the organization began disrupting scientific meetings and started a magazine, also called Science for the People. These actions in the magazine resulted in media exposure and rapid growth. Soon, active chapters were present in dozens of US cities and towns, and eventually in other countries. The Boston-Cambridge area was the epicenter of Science for the People's activities. In 1971, 2 members purchased a house on 9 Walden Street, again across from the projects, and started something called the Helen Keller Collective, which was a home to a small group of like-minded radical activists. Out of this house, Science for the People ran its activities and published its magazine. The collective lasted until 1975, at which point the members gave the house for free to a family from the housing projects. Now, that it was called the Helen Keller Collective speaks to another site that we include in the book, and to the fact that Boston was where Helen Keller went to school for a number of years in the 1890s at the Perkins School for the Blind, the longtime site of which is located where the South Boston District Courthouse now sits. It was at the courthouse on March 31st, 1966, that 4 members of the Boston chapter for the Committee of Nonviolent Action, which was a national pacifist organization, gathered and proceeded to burn their draft cards. As they did so, scores of young people from the area, South Boston High School was just a couple of blocks away, attacked and assaulted the activists. Eventually, a grand jury in Boston indicted them, right, the activists, charging them with breaking the federal prohibition against burning draft cards. Right? All were found guilty and imprisoned, with the case of one of them going all the way to the Supreme Court. Nonetheless, the burning and destruction of, in protest against the federal prohibition against draft card burning continued, right? In a lot of ways inspired by what took place in Boston, right? Especially as opposition to the US war in Vietnam intensified. Now, growing up in Boston, I learned a lot about Helen Keller, but only as someone who heroically overcame personal hardship. But I didn't learn that she was an outspoken radical activist, a member of the Socialist Party, a member of the Wobblies, or the Industrial Workers of the World, who played a key role in the 1912 strike in Lawrence that Eleni mentioned. She also championed women's suffrage, the rights of workers, socialism, and pacifism. In some ways, we might say she inspired what took place in the courthouse that day in South Boston, in addition to the work of Science for the People. Now, the war in Vietnam was, of course, central to left activism in the 60s and 70s in Boston, but again, there was a lot more going on, not least in East Boston, home to Logan Airport. Right? Logan now makes up literally 2/3 of East Boston's land. Due to its eating up of more and more of the neighborhood's land, including residential areas and public parks, and all the pollution related to its operation, Logan was a frequent target of neighborhood protests during the 60s and 70s. These protests often involved a multiracial group of residents from places like Cambridge, Jamaica Plain, Mattapan, Roxbury, and South End. Again, remember, this was also when there were lots of racial tensions happening related to the desegregation of public schools. Logan is a major contributor to climate breakdown, something that Suren mentioned at the very beginning. Flights from Logan alone are responsible for millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year, more than the total annual emissions for all activities generated by many of the world's lowest income countries, such as Haiti and Zambia. Curiously, though, if you look at the city of Boston's reports on dealing with climate change, they say almost nothing about the airport. In fact, the city does not include flights as part of its measurements of Boston's carbon footprint. Were they to do so, it would become clear that cutting CO2 emissions necessitates a radical downsizing of Logan. Let me quickly mention one other important activist formation that emerged in Boston during the 1970s, and that was on Moultrie Street in Dorchester. Right? That's near Shawmut Station for the Bostonians on the Red Line. Right? It was there that a group of Black women activists, each with long histories in the anti-war, feminist, and Black liberation movements, began meeting and founded what became known as the Combahee River Collective. Considering matters of gender, class, race, and sexual orientation, the members of the collective evolved a theory of liberation that has proved to be very influential both in academia and among social justice organizers, one based on the notion that oppression unfolds and is to be challenged on intersecting fronts. Accordingly, members of the collective worked with Black men in the fight against racism with white women in the struggle against male domination. And acknowledging their class position, they define themselves as socialists aiming to overthrow capitalism. Among their better-known activist work were demonstrations aimed at calling attention to a series of murders and violent attacks against Black women that the Boston Police Department was failing to investigate. Now, before moving to questions and discussion, let me just say a few things. First, as you can see, we try to cover a lot of ground in the book, spatially and historically. And trying to capture a place as diverse and dynamic as Greater Boston is highly challenging, to say the least. In that regard, we want to make clear that our goal is not to be comprehensive. Rather, our goal is to paint a suggestive portrait of an area that highlights its long contested nature. In many ways, we merely scratch the region's surface, or many surfaces, given the multiple layers that it embodies. Second, this is a book about the past, the present, and the future. And when I say the future, what I mean is that we hope that all of us can take inspiration as well as instruction from those who have preceded us and those who struggle today to create a greater Boston and the larger world it reflects and helps to make that is radically inclusive and democratic, and that centers social and environmental justice. We, the authors of the book, appreciate that we're not the first ones to write from a people's perspective about Greater Boston and the world of which it's part, nor will we be the last. We thus see the book as a small contribution to a much larger discussion, ones we are sure will continue. In that regard, we invite you to visit us at our webpage, at which we'll publish new entries and dozens of entries that we couldn't fit in the book, as well as the photos and images that we hope to show tonight, right? So we can do that, okay? And to follow us on Facebook, right? Finally, there are many people to thank, far too many to mention here, so please look at our acknowledgements in the book. But we want to thank all the great people at the UC Press, specifically, or especially Peter Perez. He's the Director of Public Relations and Communications, for his work publicizing the book and helping to bring about this event. And of course, a big thanks to Adam and Brookline Booksmith, right, which is a real vital community institution, for hosting and organizing this. One way to show your appreciation for the store is to buy your books from here. And we hope that one of your purchases will be a People's Guide to Greater Boston. And if you have a chance to read it, we welcome your feedback. So with that, let's move to questions and comments. And you can see there's the link to the website, the book's website, www.bostonbook.org. Okay.
All right, that was wonderful, guys. Thank you so much. Again, apologies that the technology revolted on us and you weren't able to show your presentation. But again, yeah, the website is in the chat there. So everybody, please head on over to the website so you can see those pictures. So I don't see any questions yet, but if anybody has any questions, down at the bottom, there's a little link there that just says ask a question. So please go on and do that if you got anything. We've got one comment so far from Penny Lewis. The website looks great, almost as great as the book itself.
You know, while we're waiting for people to throw in questions, can I just suggest, Eleni, you maybe say something about the photos in the book and the process that we uncovered those?
So the photos were a big part of my contribution. We did a lot of research with archivists. I actually see, I think someone from Northeastern is here, Molly. She helped a lot on that, so thank you, Molly. We worked with so many different institutions across Boston, the city archives. We worked with the Boston Housing Authority. We worked with the Boston Public Library, Northeastern, UMass. And we really were able to collect this wonderful collection of archival photos from all different parts of Boston and different historical moments. And some of them it wasn't always clear what photo we were going to use for the site. And some we found kind of by accident, scrolling through databases. Others, I took a bunch myself. One of my favorites is one associated with the Raytheon site that Suren mentioned in his intro. We found out that the Quakers in Cambridge, the Friends of Cambridge, do a monthly meeting at the Raytheon offices in Cambridge. And so I went one day, and it was a really powerful moment to be there with the the members of the meeting and hear what they had to say and why they were there. But it was really a journey. We discovered photos. We used maps from the Boston Public Library to cite various events and moments and streets that no longer exist. And we learned a lot throughout the process from listening to people and used a lot of activist photos as well that we gathered as we went. I don't know if people have specific questions about the photos, but I'm happy to talk more.
Looks like we've actually got some questions.
There we go.
Have come up, yeah. So we've got an anonymous question here. Could you speak to your vision of how the local public history as presented in the book can be done in such a way to inform and inspire current political movements?
I'll take a stab at it, and hopefully other people have some time to think and respond. I think that a lot of look, for one thing, we're not the first people to do this, right? And so there have been a number of walking tours done by for example, African-American historians, public historians, which have created alternatives to the Freedom Trail and a much richer history than is often presented in official sources. That said, we think that out of our book, we've identified 6 or so tours that could be done that connect the city in thematic ways. There's a native Boston tour, for example, that goes through the different sites we address, and that allow people to understand not only the events that happen in those locations, but also their meaning for today's struggles themselves, right? I'll give you an example of one, right? We mentioned the Hannah Dustin statue in Haverhill, Massachusetts, right? Which speaks to really horrific events at the end of the 17th century. But the statue itself was built in the 1870s, and debate about it continues to these very days. So right now, there's a debate about pulling down or removing that statue, with the city opting to maintain it. So the kinds of public conversations that could be had about different sites, I think, speak to the kinds of ambitions for the future that are being repressed by the powers that be, as well as to the nature of the powers that be and their entrenchment in a history of colonialism and a history of exploitation of workers. And as such, we think that these different sites have such valence for today's issues that activists themselves can use it to speak to particular moments in their own struggles right now.
Suren, could you just say what the Hannah Dustin statue is about?
Yeah. So Hannah Dustin was a legendary figure, right? Another legendary figure from that period is Cotton Mather, the Boston theologian who was also part of the Salem witch trials. But he made Hannah Dustin famous in a sense that he sermonized about Hannah Dustin. What did she do to deserve a sermon from the great Cotton Mather, right? Well, one of the things, the story is as follows. She was captured by the Abenaki people and taken captive together with her housemaid and a newborn child, and taken into what is probably today New Hampshire or part of Vermont. And from there, she was placed in an Abenaki family in a period, and there's a lot of history to go into here, right? But this was a period of contest for what was the frontier, right? The long and the short of it is she escapes the captivity of the Abenaki, but as she escapes, after she's left the place, she makes a decision to go back and massacre the family while they slept, right? And then she had the presence of mind, after killing them in their sleep, to remove their scalps so that she could have evidence of her act. She then escapes back to present-day Haverhill. A story becomes known in Boston, and she gets a reward for those scalps. The statue in Haverhill itself not only is a picture of a defiant Hannah Dustin, but they have several friezes on the statue itself, which depict the act of scalping people and of fleeing from New Hampshire, or from the future New Hampshire. And so you can imagine that this is a very one-sided presentation of history. This was also one of the first statues in the United States to depict a woman. So this was then, the model for what womanhood in America should be, the picture of the strong, independent frontier woman. So all the kinds of things that we want to think about today as we try to undo so much that has gone wrong in our society. So yeah, in that sense, Hannah Dustin is very much relevant to our moment.
Awesome, thank you. The next question, you said a bit about the choices you needed to make to decide which sites to choose. What were some of the hardest choices you faced, and what were some of the easiest?
So we wrote about over 240 sites. We ended up putting 116 to the book. And even with the number 240, there were a lot more sites that we wanted to research, could not find enough information about it, and so left them out. And so there were a lot of tough choices, but I've spoken a lot. And so I'm sure that Eleni and Joe can name some of their favorite sites that are not included in the book itself, which would speak to the hard decision-making we had to.
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, let's say in terms of easy ones to include. So, Fenway Park, which Eleni spoke about, is not a site we probably normally would have included. But when we found out, thanks to a historian at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, Bob Forant, who was a huge help to us, about what had taken place in 1919, the very event that Eleni spoke about, we knew that we had to include that in the book, right? Because it challenges, what we want to do is give people a different lens, an alternative lens to understanding the city in which they live or are visiting, they're encountering. And that speaks, 1919, the Irish nationalist anti-colonial demonstration and gathering at Fenway Park gives us a very different lens for understanding not only Fenway Park, but Boston as a whole at the time, right? And then there were sites that really we knew nothing about, that we just sort of encountered serendipitously. So Eleni spoke earlier about the process of photos. And fortunately, there are, as she made clear, there are lots of great resources. And one of them is called the Digital Commonwealth. This is an online source of all sorts of different archives. And at one point, I think it was I was looking for something associated with the Charlestown Navy Yard. And when we think about the Charlestown Navy Yard, for those of us who are familiar with the city of Boston, the immediate thing we think about is Old Ironsides, right? The USS Constitution, a very famous warship. And in looking for images related to that, I came across, I'll just try to show this on camera, right, if people can see it. Can people see that photo? Okay, so you notice these are 4 German naval officers in 1934 and the German ambassador to the United States at Charlestown Naval Yard. And you'll notice there's a Nazi flag behind them. What are Nazi naval officials doing in Charlestown Navy Yard? Well, they're on an official goodwill tour. Hitler has very recently come to power, right? And people in Boston and people in the state of Massachusetts, especially officialdom, welcome them with open arms. Now, it turns out, and this is part of the way that this came to our attention, in 1934 there was a riot in City Square in Charlestown, and the orange line used to run right through City Square, where it was an elevated line, right? But City Square is where was the first seat of government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Right? Charlestown is actually the oldest neighborhood of the city of Boston. Right? Charlestown was settled by European colonists in 1629. And in response to the presence of the Karlsruhe, this Nazi Germany ship, thousands of activists descended upon City Square to protest its presence. These were labor activists, these were members of the Communist Party, these were members of Jewish community and civil rights organizations to protest the ship. presence, and the police rioted and beat up hundreds of these demonstrators. But that wasn't the end of the visit. Right? At the Copley Plaza Hotel in Copley Square, right across from the main branch of the Boston Public Library, there was an official dinner at which the mayor of Boston, the governor of Massachusetts attended. And at the dinner in the grand ballroom of the Copley Plaza Hotel, the flag of Germany and the United States and the Nazi flag hung from the ceiling. And if you read, and we talk about this in the book, if you go back and read the accounts from the Boston Herald or the Daily Boston Globe, they celebrated the presence of these German sailors here. Right? But at the same time, so it speaks to, both anti-Semitism at the city, in Greater Boston at the time, but the contestation also speaks to the fact that many in Greater Boston were not willing to accept this and struggled against it. So that was a site that was really important for us to have in there. In terms of places that we didn't include, I hate to say it given where we're speaking today, but we had to decide not to include any place in Brookline. Not that we didn't think Brookline's important, but these were just some of the difficult choices that we had to make. And so obviously in thinking about dominant ideas about nature, Frederick Law Olmsted's estate is really important in U.S. and world history, but we didn't include that in the book. We intend to include that on the website as we continue to build the People's Guide to Greater Boston beyond the book. It's something that it's an ongoing project.
I can speak to one other site that we didn't include that I thought was quite fascinating was the Charles Street Prison, Charles Street Jail, which is now the Liberty Hotel, which is part of why I find it so shocking in many ways. The jail was around for many years. It was the Suffolk County Jail. And many people that we know of spent nights there. Malcolm X spent nights there, Sacco and Vanzetti, many others, and ended up being closed because of horrible conditions. A judge spent the night in the jail to see what it was like and decided the next day that it was not suitable. So it was closed forever. Now the hotel has kind of celebrated the incarceration as a theme. If you go in, there are they've kept the bars in some of the rooms. They give you a key as like a skeleton key as one of your keys to get into your room. The bar is called the Ally, or they're all themes around incarceration. Anyways, it was a very shocking thing to kind of go there and see that, and especially because it was closed due to the conditions of incarcerated people there. Anyways, that's just one more that was not included in the book, but we'll include on the website.
Awesome. I think we got time for one more question. What are a few? This is from Ann Coles. What are a few of the things that surprised you among everything you learned?
Well, yeah, something for trivia. I mentioned Cotton Mather earlier. We have an entry in the book about Cotton Mather and an enslaved person he owned, Onesimus. And we tried to locate Cotton Mather's house. And we found it in the North End, no longer a surviving structure. And the current occupiers of that place, all Bostonians will know this, right, is Mike's Pastry. So there's an interesting connection between that history. So that was a sort of a pleasant sort of surprise that brought a smile to our faces. Anything more serious?
Well, I think, I don't know if it's a surprise, but it was, the learning curve to put this book together was extremely steep. And we learned a ton by working together and working on the project. And I think one of the most important things that we learned is how little we know, right? Which makes it so fascinating to do this type of work. And it's all the more important that people, just as we're building on the work of other peoples and movements over time and space, we hope that others build on what we've done, because this is part of an ongoing, not only dialogue, but an ongoing struggle, again, to realize, to achieve, to bring about a Boston, a greater Boston that's truly of the people.
All right. I think we can do. What do you guys think? One more question.
Sure.
All right. Last one. How did you do the research for the book, and how long did it take you?
Eleni, why don't you take that one?
Well, I joined the project in 2014, so 6 years ago. In terms of the research, it was so many different things. I mean, it was conversations with people and then follow-up conversations with someone that they mentioned, and talking a lot with the research librarians of the Boston Public Library, doing archival research, like I mentioned. We did a lot of microfiche research. It was really all over the place in terms of, how we gathered information. We also drew upon a lot of experts in the region on various subjects. So whether it was housing or transportation, we really tapped into the resources that experts, people who've done this work for a long time, to understand their views and what they thought was important to include.
The other thing is we walked around a lot, right? We spent a lot of time in the streets and neighborhoods in and around Boston. And that in itself helped to reveal a lot to us, as did a lot, engaging secondary literature, right? The scholarship on Greater Boston is enormous. Of course, there are lots of holes in that, but that was a huge advantage that we had, as well as a burden, right? Because we had to go through a lot of that to begin to make sense of what we were seeing and trying to understand. So,
I think I should just add one more point to that. We spoke with a lot of organizers and activists, especially those associated with the Encuentro Cinco movement space where I operate. I irritated everyone, as did Joe and Eleni, I think, because we had constant questions. A lot of things people thought they knew about, and they would tell us about it, and then we'd have to go back and check their memories against what we could document. And it was a very difficult process, and oftentimes people remembered things better than they were actually documented in any one place. And so one had to constantly be in dialogue with the different sources. And in that sense, by the virtue of the fact that so many activists, among the more than 250 people we thank, that there are so many activists in that, makes it a people's history or a people's guide.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. That was fantastic. I'm sure everyone out there in the audience, the authors would super appreciate it if you were to buy the book. That green button is down there at the bottom, so you can still do that. Also, Brookline Booksmith is now actually open again. So if you wanted to come into the store, we can order the book for you, and I'm pretty sure that we have copies on hand. But for now, Joseph, Suren, Eleni, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for a truly wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Adam.
Good night, everyone.